There once was a kingdom, though you might not have heard of it. It wasn't known for anything in particular. Not for war, not for wealth, not for wonders. It simply existed, day after day, season after season, quietly pressed between distant hills and trees that swayed with just enough wind to stay upright. The castle at the heart of the kingdom wasn't grand. It wasn't towering or carved from sparkling marble. Instead, it was made of thick grey stone, laid one piece at a time by workers who had done the job slowly, without rushing. The stones had slightly different shapes, not perfectly rectangular, not fully uniform. If you ran your hand along one of the walls, which no one really did, you'd feel the small differences. A corner sticking out here, a worn patch there. Nothing sharp, nothing dramatic, just a wall doing what it was built to do. The courtyard was square, not quite a perfect square, but close. Patches of grass grew up between the stones underfoot. They were green in the spring, yellow in the fall, and stiff with frost in the winter. The grass wasn't trimmed often, but never grew too wild. It just stayed in its place, mostly behaving. There were birds in the trees beyond the gate, sparrows, mostly, not singing much. They made small sounds in the morning, not loud, not quiet, just the kind of noises birds make when they aren't busy doing anything else. Inside the castle lived a princess. Her name wasn't sung by bards or carved into the walls of libraries. It was a name people used when they needed to find her or call her in for dinner. Not a grand name, not a short one. A name that worked well enough, something soft, maybe starting with an E. But she wasn't the type to correct you if you got it wrong. She lived on the upper floor in a long room with a tall window. The window faced the hills, which were always a little hazy in the distance, sometimes blue, sometimes grey. Once or twice a year, she thought she saw snow on the farthest peak, but it always melted before anyone could be sure. Her bed sat near the middle of the room, neither against the wall nor too far from it. The headboard was carved wood, not ornate, just old. The mattress had been refilled twice since she was a child, though she couldn't tell the difference. The blanket was wool, somewhat scratchy, with a faint smell of lavender that never fully went away. Each morning, the princess woke up at the same time, give or take a few minutes. Not because she was told to, and not because something woke her, but because her body had decided long ago that it preferred the sun when it had just begun to rise above the trees. The light was better then, pale and quiet. It crept in through the window without making a fuss. She would sit up, stretch one arm and then the other, and pause. Not for any reason, really, just to look around. The same wardrobe, the same corner chair with a cushion that had flattened years ago, the same half-used candle sitting on the table by her bed, with its wick curled like a sleeping bug. There were things to do in the castle, but not very many. Some days she sat in the library, though she had already read every book there that she was interested in. Other days, she sat in the garden, but not to admire flowers or chase butterflies. She just sat, sometimes near the hedge, sometimes on a flat stone shaped roughly like a slice of bread. She wasn't unhappy, not particularly, but she wasn't particularly delighted either. Her days had a rhythm, and she followed it like someone walking a path that has no turns. On many afternoons, she walked to the well. It wasn't a deep well, nor was it especially old. It had been rebuilt once, after a mild earthquake several decades ago that had knocked loose a few stones. The rebuild wasn't urgent. It took almost a year to finish, but no one was rushing. The well had a round stone lip, smooth on the sides, slightly warm to the touch in summer and gently cold in winter. A bucket sat nearby, always dry. It hadn't been used in years, since the castle's newer plumbing had been installed. But still, the well remained, not as a tool, but as a place to be. The princess liked to sit beside it. She brought with her a golden ball, perfectly round, heavier than it looked, and always cool no matter the weather. She had owned it since childhood, and though she didn't particularly love it, she didn't dislike it either. It gave her something to hold, something to throw upward and catch again. A way to fill minutes that didn't need filling. She tossed the ball with both hands. It would rise into the air, slow at the top, then fall neatly back into her palms. Sometimes she missed. When she did, the ball bounced once, maybe twice, before settling in the grass. There was no goal, no game, no counting, just throwing and catching. Occasionally, she'd whisper to herself, "That was a good one," or "too far," but no one was listening, so it didn't matter. The wind would rustle the grass around her ankles. A leaf might fall. The clouds above drifted in such a lazy, indifferent way that you couldn't be sure they were moving unless you watched them for a long, long time, which she sometimes did. People occasionally passed through the courtyard, a cook returning from the herb garden, or a guard walking too slowly to be guarding much, but they rarely spoke to her. They knew she preferred the kind of quiet that didn't require silence, the kind of quiet that lets thoughts come and go without needing to be acted on. And so the days continued. Light became dark, dark became light. Rain fell, but never for long. The moss on the well darkened in dampness and lightened again when the sun returned. The golden ball kept rising and falling, always returning to the same small hands. The princess sometimes wondered if this was what all days were like in other castles, if other princesses sat by other wells, if they too had balls made of gold or silver or wood, tossed toward skies that were never quite blue. But she didn't wonder very often, not because she had the answers, but because wondering felt like work, and she wasn't in the mood for work. On one such afternoon, with the clouds just slightly thicker than usual and the air smelling faintly of wet stone, the princess threw the golden ball a little too high. It spun upward, more quickly than usual. She reached out, but not quickly enough. The ball fell, bounced once, and rolled. Not far, but far enough. It tipped over the edge of the well. There was a pause. She stood, walked to the edge, and looked in. The well was not deep, but it was deep enough that the bottom wasn't immediately visible. She waited, just to see if she could hear the soft splash. Eventually, she thought she did, or maybe imagined it. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She simply stood, hands resting lightly on the stone, staring down into the shadowed roundness below. And for a while, nothing else happened. The well stood there, as it always had. The stones were still in place. The moss hadn't shifted. The wind hadn't picked up. And yet, something was different now. The golden ball, the one object in the princess's life that had a shape, a sound, a weight, was no longer beside her. She stood quietly for a while, gazing into the circular blackness of the well. The opening was neither large nor small. It was just the right size for a person to stand beside and think. Something might live in there, even if nothing did. But it wasn't the kind of well you climbed into, or tied ropes around for dramatic descents. It wasn't adventurous like that. It was just a well. The air smelled the same, slightly damp, slightly earthy, with a trace of old water and stones that had absorbed many seasons of silence. The princess leaned in a little more and rested her palms on the stone edge. Her fingers found the familiar pits and cracks, the ones she had known since childhood, the ones her hands always found without looking. She stayed like that for some time, maybe minutes, maybe longer. There was no one nearby to tell the time, and even if they had been, they probably wouldn't have said anything. This was her moment, and though it wasn't a loud or dramatic moment, it was hers nonetheless. Somewhere nearby, a small bird chirped once and then stopped. Not because it was alarmed or curious, just because that's what birds do. A single note, then silence. Then perhaps another note later, but not now. The princess breathed out slowly, not sighing, but not exactly just exhaling either. It was a breath that felt like the ending of something very small, like the closing of a tiny door inside her mind. She thought, briefly, about asking someone to help retrieve the ball. Perhaps a servant or a stable hand, or one of the younger guards who still had knees strong enough to squat. But the idea felt like effort, and effort felt like motion, and motion wasn't something she was interested in just then. So she waited a little longer. And that's when she heard it. Not a voice, exactly. Not at first. Just a sound. A sort of bubbling rustle, like wet leaves moving in a shallow pool. It wasn't alarming. It wasn't even curious. It was just unexpected. The princess blinked and looked around. Nothing moved in the garden. The hedge still sat quietly in its line. The trees continued to sway in that long, lazy way they always had. But the sound had come from somewhere. She was sure of that. Then, again, came the sound. Closer now, and this time it was accompanied by something almost like a croak, though not quite. It wasn't the sharp, rhythmic croak of a marsh frog at dusk. It was slower, thicker, and more deliberate, like a sound that had to climb out of sleep before becoming real. She turned her head toward the edge of the well, just slightly, and then looked down again. At first, she saw nothing, just the shadowed circle. Then, after a few more seconds, or perhaps half a minute, she noticed something moving near the lip of the well. Something small, something green, not a leaf, not a shadow, but a shape. And then it moved again, a single, deliberate hop, and then it spoke. It didn't speak quickly, it didn't speak loudly. It spoke in the way that moss might speak, if moss had lips, soft, steady, and with words that carried no weight. The voice said, "You seem to have lost something." The princess blinked. She didn't answer right away. There wasn't much to say, and she wasn't entirely sure she had heard what she thought she had. But the voice came again. "I saw it fall, a golden ball. It landed at the bottom." The princess looked closer and finally saw him, the frog. He was larger than most frogs she had seen, though not unnaturally so. He had a roundness to him, like a smooth stone that had sat at the edge of a river for too long. His skin was dark green, with patches of duller green, and a few spots the color of faded parchment. He was still, very still. Only his throat moved, slowly in and out, like the lazy rise and fall of a cushion in an empty room. "You saw it?" the princess finally asked, her voice quieter than usual. "I did," the frog replied, with a long pause after. It fell very gently, like something that meant to fall. The princess wasn't sure what to make of that. Things usually fell without meaning to, but she didn't argue. "Is it still down there?" she asked. The frog made a sound, not quite a yes, not quite a no, just a sound. "It is," he said. "It's resting. I could bring it back, but such things take time, and something in return." The princess didn't move. "Something," she repeated. "Yes," the frog said. "A small thing, a promise." She tilted her head slightly. A breeze moved past her cheek and stirred her hair in a soft spiral. "What kind of promise?" The frog blinked, once, slowly. "To let me sit with you," he said, "at your table, in your room. Not forever, just for a while." The princess didn't answer right away. Not because she was frightened or repelled, but because it was a strange thing to ask, and strange things always moved slower in her mind, like syrup poured in winter. She looked at the frog. He hadn't moved again, not even slightly, just sat there, watching her with the kind of calm that made it difficult to be annoyed. "All right," she said eventually, "if you bring it back." The frog didn't respond with joy. He didn't jump or laugh or croak with triumph. He simply turned, one small motion at a time, and lowered himself slowly over the lip of the well. There was a moment of silence, then another and another. The princess stared, and then, after what could have been a minute, or two, or more, the frog returned, with the golden ball balanced precariously on his wide head, between two eyes that glistened like stones left out in the rain. He nudged the ball toward her. It rolled slowly across the stone lip and settled near her hand. She picked it up. It was just as it had always been, round, cool, heavy, without sound. The princess looked at the frog again. He sat there, breathing. "I have brought it," he said, as promised. She didn't say anything, she just nodded. "I will find you later," said the frog. The princess didn't answer. She turned slowly, golden ball in hand, and walked back toward the castle. Her steps made no sound on the grass. The air around her felt still. The sky above remained colorless. Behind her, the frog sat alone at the edge of the well, breathing, watching, waiting. He did not follow, not yet. The princess walked slowly across the garden, golden ball in hand. She didn't run, she didn't skip. She didn't even walk with purpose. Each step was deliberate, not because she had made it so, but because it felt easier to move slowly than quickly. The grass beneath her shoes was soft and thick, still a little damp from the morning dew, which hadn't entirely dried. Some places in the garden were always a little wet, even when the sun had been up for hours. This was one of those days. The ball felt the same in her hand as it always had. Smooth, cold, not very heavy, but not light either. It had a certain gravity to it, the kind of weight that came not from the material itself, but from the importance placed upon it. It was, after all, her favorite thing, or at least it had been. And now, after everything, it was back, whole, unchanged, unharmed. She had it again. That was all. As she walked, the castle loomed slowly back into view. It never disappeared entirely. It was too large for that. But from certain angles behind the trees, it felt smaller, more distant. Now, as she returned, it grew larger again, though not menacingly so. Just ... inevitably, like the way a shadow lengthens at the end of the day. The walls were the same as ever, thick, grey, unchanging, a little rough in texture. The stones stacked in even lines, one atop the next, as though no one had ever questioned where they should go. Moss grew in certain places, but not in others. Ivy climbed some walls, but never crossed over onto others. That was the way of things. The main entrance, a pair of tall wooden doors, had been left ajar, as they often were in the daylight hours, and she didn't need to knock or call for anyone to open them. They creaked slightly as she pushed through, but only just. It was the kind of creak that had been there for years, one that nobody really noticed anymore. Inside, the air changed, slightly cooler, less touched by wind. It carried the scent of old stone and candle wax and something like parchment that had been folded for a long time. A stillness lived in those halls, not quiet exactly, but not noise either. Just the kind of presence that comes when many footsteps have passed, and many conversations have faded, but none of them have left completely. She passed the large hallway slowly, not looking up at the tapestries, though she knew each one by heart. They had hung there since she was a child. Each thread, each faded color, each embroidered face of long-forgotten relatives or heroes she had never cared much for. All of them familiar. All of them still. A servant passed by, carrying something folded in linen. Perhaps towels, or napkins, or some other necessary fabric, and nodded politely, but said nothing. The princess did not speak either. There was nothing to say, not yet. She climbed the stairs, one by one, her hand grazing the banister only out of habit, not need. The banister had a smoothness to it that only came from generations of hands passing over the same worn path. It curved gently at the turn of the staircase, and she followed its line without thought. Her room was on the east side of the castle, where the light arrived earlier in the day and left sooner in the afternoon. The door was closed, as it always was when she wasn't inside. She paused briefly, not because she didn't want to go in, but because she didn't feel particularly eager to either. Once inside, she placed the golden ball on the small marble table near the window. It didn't roll, it simply rested there, as if it had always been meant to sit in that very spot. She sat down on the cushioned bench beside the window, the one she often used to read or simply look out over the gardens. The view was unchanged. The hedges had not moved. The trees swayed as they always did. A bird flew by, then another. Neither stopped. Time passed. A maid arrived with a tray. Afternoon tea, or something like it. A small cup, some bread, a bit of butter, a slice of fruit. The kind of thing one was expected to eat in the late hours of the afternoon, not out of hunger, but because it was what people did. She sipped the tea slowly. It was warm, but not hot, mild in flavor, perhaps chamomile or something close to it. The bread was soft, slightly uneven around the edges, as if it had been cut in a hurry, but it tasted fine. She ate it all without thinking much about it. The hours between afternoon and evening often blurred together in the castle. Light changed, yes, but not quickly. It dimmed slowly, like a lantern wick turned by degrees. The candles were not lit yet, but would be soon. No one announced these things. They just happened, and then they were done. As evening approached, the princess remained in her room. She did not go to the dining hall. Dinner would be served, of course, as it always was. Soup, perhaps, and some roasted vegetables, and bread again, and something pickled on the side. But she didn't feel drawn to it. Instead, she stayed near the window, watching the sky shift from pale gold to dusty lavender, then to a quiet grey. The clouds moved slowly, as though they, too, had grown tired of holding shape. She thought about the frog, not with urgency, not with curiosity, just occasionally. She remembered the way he had spoken, slowly, softly, without emotion. The way he had waited by the well, the way he had looked at her, not pleading, not hopeful, just watching. She wondered, vaguely, whether he would actually come to the castle, and if he did, whether he would remember the promise, or whether she would. It didn't seem important, either way. She picked up the golden ball again, turned it in her hands, let the light catch on its surface. It reflected little. Its shine had dulled slightly, or maybe the sky had darkened just enough to mute its glow. It didn't matter. Eventually, the candles were lit, not by her, by someone else. A maid, perhaps, or the quiet old man who tended the upper halls and moved without sound. The flames flickered at first, then steadied. The room warmed slightly, but not much. She removed her shoes, one, then the other, placed them by the foot of the bed. They leaned slightly against each other, not touching, but close. Then she stood in the center of the room for a while, not doing anything, not thinking anything in particular, just standing, breathing, watching the candlelight dance against the walls. The knock came late. It was soft, 3 slow taps. She didn't answer at first, not because she was frightened. She wasn't, but because she wasn't certain she'd heard it. Then it came again. 3 more, still soft, still slow. She walked to the door. Not quickly, not slowly, just at the pace one walks when they already know what they will find on the other side. She opened it. There, at the threshold, sat the frog. He did not smile. Frogs don't smile. He didn't bow. He didn't move. He simply looked up at her. "I have come," he said, "as promised." The princess looked down. And then, without invitation, without command, the frog hopped forward. 1 small hop, then another, then he stopped just inside the doorway, breathing quietly. She did not send him away. She did not welcome him either. She simply turned and walked slowly back to her seat by the window. The frog followed. The frog entered the room, not with haste or excitement, but with the kind of stillness that seems to settle around a creature who is never in a hurry. 1 hop, then a pause, another hop, then another pause. He did not speak again, nor did he croak or chirp or make any other noise. He simply moved with careful intention, each motion as quiet as the last. The princess remained seated by the window, her hand resting near the golden ball, which had not moved from its place on the marble table. She did not look at the frog as he approached, though she was aware of him, not in the way one is aware of a guest, but more like how one is aware of a breeze that has entered through a forgotten crack in the wall. Something that was now here, but had no real reason to be noticed. Eventually, the frog stopped beside the low rug in the center of the chamber. He did not speak, nor did he appear to wait for anything in particular. He simply sat, very still, as though being there was all he had intended to do. A knock came at the door, a softer one this time, and more routine. The kind of knock that meant a servant was outside, carrying something ordinary and expected. The princess rose, slowly. Her dress rustled faintly as she crossed the floor, the hem brushing against the stone in a rhythmic whisper. When she opened the door, a maid stood on the other side, holding a tray. The maid curtsied briefly, eyes cast downward, and offered the tray forward. On it were 2 small plates of food, nothing extravagant, and a covered dish with steam curling round the lid's edge. "Your supper, Highness," the maid said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though even she didn't want to disturb the quiet. The princess nodded, but said nothing. She took the tray gently and carried it inside. The frog watched her move across the room. He did not follow her, nor did he react when she placed the tray on the table beside her. She did not ask him if he was hungry. She did not speak at all. She sat. The tray was made of silver, though dull with age. A slight dent curved near one edge, perhaps from a long-forgotten fall. One of the plates held bread, thick, uneven slices with crusts slightly too dark. The other plate held a small portion of roasted root vegetables, carrots, turnips, and perhaps a parsnip or 2, each glistening with a soft sheen of oil. The covered dish revealed a pale broth when its lid was lifted, steam rising slowly and disappearing into the dim light. The princess picked up the spoon. The bowl was not deep, but she did not fill the spoon all the way. Instead, she took a small amount of the broth and brought it to her lips. She sipped without slurping. She chewed nothing. She did not close her eyes, nor did she react to the taste. It was warm, that was all. Another spoonful followed, and then another. It took a long time. Each bite came slowly, separated by a stretch of silence long enough to hear the faint tick of the hallway clock outside her door. The frog remained where he was. His eyes did not blink. Frogs seldom do. But he shifted once, as though to better angle himself toward the table. Eventually, after many minutes had passed, the princess reached for the bread. She broke it in half with both hands. Crumbs scattered on the plate. She did not brush them away. Instead, she pressed one half of the bread to the edge of the soup bowl, allowing it to absorb a little broth, then lifted it to her mouth. She chewed very slowly and swallowed without sound. The frog took one hop forward. She noticed, and without speaking, she reached down and placed the second half of the bread on the rug beside him. He looked at it. He did not eat it. He did not move toward it. But it was there now, between them. Time passed again. The candle beside the window had begun to lean slightly, its wax dripping into a small dish that had been placed beneath it. A single strand of melted wax curled like a ribbon, hardened in a looping shape that would never change again. Outside the window, the sky had grown darker still, not pitch black, but something like a faded blue wool blanket, soft and heavy and muted. She took another bite of vegetable, a carrot this time, soft, flavorless perhaps, but warm. When she had eaten nearly everything, she pushed the tray slightly to one side and leaned back in her chair. Her hands rested in her lap. She looked across the room, not at the frog, not at the food, but somewhere else, somewhere vague, somewhere only half remembered. The frog hopped again. Now he was near her feet. Still, he said nothing. The princess looked down. Their eyes met. He blinked. She did not. She leaned forward slowly and picked up the frog with both hands. He did not resist. His body was cool and damp, but not unpleasantly so, more like a stone that had been sitting near a quiet stream. She held him for a moment, looking at him without expression. Then she stood. Across the room was the fireplace. It had not been lit that evening. The logs were stacked neatly, and the ashes from the night before had been swept into the tray beneath. She walked past it, past the foot of her bed, past the carved wooden chest that held her nightclothes, to the far end of the room, where a low stool sat beside a folded blanket. She placed the frog gently on the stool. He did not move. She unfolded the blanket and draped it lightly over him. It did not cover him completely, just enough to suggest the gesture. Then she turned away. She walked to the mirror. It was tall and thin and old. The glass slightly rippled, the way old glass often is, warped in places, making her reflection seem less sharp, less real. She undid her hair, slowly, one pin at a time, each one placed carefully in a small dish. Her hair fell past her shoulders, curling slightly at the ends. She did not rush. She did not glance at the frog again. She did not speak. When at last she moved toward the bed, it was without ceremony. She peeled back the blanket, the same one she had used every night since the season had turned cool, and slipped beneath it. The sheets were not cold. They were simply room temperature, neither warm nor cool, just present. She lay still. The candle beside the bed still burned, its flame gently swaying. The frog remained on the stool. He had not spoken again. He had not moved. The room breathed a kind of stillness that rarely arrived, even in such a quiet place. It wasn't the kind of stillness that asked to be noticed. It simply existed, a peaceful, invisible presence that wrapped around the bedposts and gathered in the corners like soft dust. Her eyes did not close right away. They stayed open, watching the ceiling. The patterns in the stone there had always looked a little like waves, curved lines etched from age, cracks stretching like distant shorelines. She watched them for a while, not thinking, not thinking, just letting her gaze drift, the way one watches clouds without hoping to understand their shape. At some point, though she could not say when, her eyelids grew heavier. The candle dipped, the wax dripped, the frog shifted once beneath the blanket, and then all was still again. When morning arrived, it did not make a grand entrance. It did not burst through the windows or scatter golden light across the floor. It arrived gradually, as though it had forgotten it was expected, and wandered in by accident. The pale light crept across the room in soft, colorless patches, illuminating the edges of things without urgency or intention. Nothing sparkled, nothing shone. The day simply began in the quietest way possible. The princess did not wake with a start. There was no yawn or stretch or rustling of sheets. Instead, her eyes drifted open slowly, unfocused at first, as though unsure whether waking was truly necessary. She did not immediately sit up. She remained still, resting her head against the pillow, blinking only occasionally, her gaze fixed on a corner of the ceiling where the stone curved slightly, casting a shadow that resembled a sleeping animal, the kind you imagine you see when you're only half awake. For a while, she lay there, not thinking, not dreaming, not quite present in either world. The room was filled with the sound of nothing, the kind of gentle silence that only exists in the early hours, when even the wind has not yet made up its mind about blowing. Eventually, her hand moved. Just slightly, her fingers brushed against the edge of the blanket, tracing the thread of the embroidered border that ran in a looping pattern. She didn't lift it. She didn't adjust it. She simply touched it, as if to confirm that it was still there, and that she was, too. She turned her head, very slowly. The candle on the bedside table had burned out at some point in the night. A tiny stub of wax remained, hardened into a new shape. It looked nothing like its former self. Near the cold wick, a faint smudge of soot had crept across the silver tray, like a shadow frozen in place. And then her eyes moved further, toward the stool at the far end of the room. The blanket draped there had not shifted. It still hung awkwardly across the shape of the frog, just as she had left it the night before. The stool had not moved. The frog had not moved. Everything was as it had been. It was as though the room had taken a long breath and held it all night. The princess sat up. Slowly, she did not swing her legs over the side of the bed immediately. She remained seated, hands in her lap, hair a little tangled from the pillow. She blinked a few more times, not because her eyes were dry or irritated, but because that's what one does when sleep has loosened its grip, but not entirely let go. Eventually, her feet found the floor. The stone was cool, not unpleasantly cold, just cool enough to notice. She stood. Her nightgown hung loosely from her shoulders, its hem brushing the tops of her feet as she moved across the room in slow, soft steps. She passed the fireplace, still dark, still untouched, and paused near the window. She opened the shutter halfway. The morning outside was a dull one. The sky was grey in the way that soft wool is grey. Not stormy, not heavy, just ... undecided. A few birds sat silently on the rooftop across the courtyard. Feathers puffed up against the breeze that wasn't really a breeze at all, just air passing through the world without purpose. A servant's cart moved far below. One wheel squeaked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rhythmic. It simply squeaked once, then not again. The princess let the shutter remain open and turned back toward the room. The frog, still beneath the blanket, blinked. Or maybe he didn't. It was hard to say. She walked toward the stool, her steps making almost no sound against the stone floor. When she reached him, she did not crouch. She did not pick him up. She simply stood, looking down at the strange little shape beneath the blanket. The frog looked up at her. His eyes were round, as they always were. Still, she said nothing. There was nothing urgent to say. Instead, she walked to the wash basin near the wall. It was made of tin, slightly dented, filled halfway with water that had gone cool in the night. She dipped her hands in, then patted her face gently. The water felt like nothing in particular. Not too cold, not warm, not scented, just water. She dried her face with a plain cloth and folded it neatly. She combed her hair slowly, using a wooden comb with a missing tooth. Each stroke took its time, from crown to tip. Then again, and again. She did not rush. She dressed next. There was no fancy gown waiting. Just a plain blue one, slightly wrinkled, smelling faintly of lavender and dust. The sleeves were long and narrow, the collar soft and rounded. She buttoned it herself, beginning from the top, working downward, one loop at a time. When she finished, she folded her nightgown and placed it in the wooden chest, closing the lid without a sound. She turned back to the frog. He had not left the stool. He had not moved. Still beneath the blanket, he sat very still, as though unsure whether morning had truly arrived, or whether it mattered if it had. She stepped toward him, bent down, and picked him up again. His skin was cool, just like before. She held him in both hands and carried him, not as one carries something delicate or important, but simply as one carries something that is meant to be moved. She placed him gently on the windowsill. He sat there, legs tucked beneath him, eyes half open. Together, they looked outside. There was a tree near the edge of the courtyard. Its branches moved just enough to make a sound. The kind of sound that doesn't register until you've been listening for a long time. The breeze shifted a few leaves. Not many, just 2 or 3. The frog did not react. The princess did not speak. Eventually, she turned from the window. There was breakfast. Somewhere, likely being placed in the dining hall now. It would be the same as it always was. Porridge, bread, something spreadable, maybe jam, a pot of tea, quietly steeping. The same seats, the same silence, the same gentle clatter of porcelain. She did not go. Not yet. Instead, she sat near the fireless hearth. The frog remained on the sill. Time passed. Not quickly, not slowly, just as it always did, unnoticed. The stones in the fireplace had collected a little dust. She brushed it away with her sleeve, not because it needed cleaning, but because her hand was there, and it felt like something to do. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Once, then silence again. She rested her chin on her hand. The frog blinked. She blinked. The air was very still. Even the breeze had gone quiet. She stayed seated, and he stayed perched, and nothing else happened. Not for a long while. Eventually, the princess stood up. There was no great decision behind it, no moment of resolve or sudden realization. It simply seemed like the next thing to do. The stone beneath her feet hadn't changed, nor had the quiet air or the soft light from the undecided sky outside. Nothing had prompted her movement. She rose slowly, as though carried by the momentum of stillness itself. The frog turned his eyes toward her, though his body remained in place on the windowsill. He didn't croak, he didn't hop, he didn't stretch his limbs or blink more than usual. He just watched, in that unblinking way that frogs do. Not with intent, not with expectation, just with a kind of lazy awareness, like someone glancing at a clock they do not truly care to read. She crossed the room. Each step was soft and deliberate. The soles of her shoes tapped against the cool stone in a pattern that didn't quite become a rhythm. There were too many pauses, too many uneven moments. Some steps were shorter than others, and some were so quiet they could hardly be counted as steps at all. It was less like walking and more like moving through memory. When she reached the frog, she didn't speak. She simply extended her hands. The frog, seeing this, shifted ever so slightly. It was not a leap, nor a hop, nor even a meaningful gesture, just a gentle tilt of the body, as if to say, yes, all right, without making much effort to say it. She lifted him again, cupping him as one might carry a stone found in a garden, something neither fragile nor precious, but still deserving of care. She held him close, but not tightly. And then, together, they left the room. The door creaked open slowly. It always did. The hinges were old, but not rusted, just worn from years of use. The kind of use that wears things into patterns rather than breaking them. The wood was thick and dry, with a slightly warped frame that caused it to stick near the bottom. She had to pull gently, then pause, then pull again. The door sighed as it opened, not groaning, not protesting, just sighing, like someone reluctantly waking from a nap. The hallway outside was not bright. It never was. The castle's corridors had few windows, and those they did have were narrow and high, letting in only slivers of morning light that didn't quite reach the floor. The walls were made of stone, the same kind as the floors, though slightly darker from years of candle smoke and cool air pressing against them. She stepped into the hallway. It smelled like stone and wood, and something faintly metallic. Not blood, not rust, just the scent of old hinges and door handles. There were torches along the walls, but none were lit. The holders were made of iron, shaped like hands gripping invisible swords. The effect was not frightening. It was simply odd. One of many strange design choices made long before her time. She walked, not quickly, not with purpose, just forward. One foot, then the other. The frog remained in her hands. His eyes did not blink much. They looked outward, past her fingers, toward the shifting shapes of the hallway. He did not seem concerned. But then, frogs rarely do. The hall stretched ahead in a long, quiet line. It was not a maze. There were no forks, no confusing turns, just a straight path. But somehow, it still felt like a place one could get lost in if they weren't careful. Not lost physically, but lost in the soft repetition of the walls, the sameness of each stone, the absence of sound. The only thing that changed was the light. It came and went in patches, thin slivers from the high windows, breaking the hallway into long, uneven segments of shadow and glow. Sometimes the glow was enough to see the pattern on the floor tiles. A faded motif of flowers and vines, carved centuries ago and long since worn to a blur. Other times, the light vanished entirely, and the hallway felt like walking through the inside of a forgotten thought. Her footfalls made a soft sound, not echoing, just ... present, and then fading again. The frog shifted slightly in her hand, not because he was uncomfortable, but perhaps just because he remembered that he could. She paused near a niche in the wall. There was a small table there, made of dark wood, too narrow to be useful, too decorative to be important. Upon it sat a vase. It held no flowers. It had never held water. It was shaped like a pitcher, but sealed at the top. Dust had gathered around its base in a fine circle. She touched it with her free hand, just one finger. It rocked slightly, then stilled again. She moved on. There was a tapestry hanging from one section of the wall. It depicted a stag in a clearing, a scene she had passed by many times and never thought much about. Today, she noticed that the stag's eye had been poorly embroidered. It was too round, too wide, giving the animal a startled, almost embarrassed expression. She paused again, staring at it for a moment longer than usual, then continued walking. Eventually, she reached a corner where a single lantern hung from a chain. It wasn't lit. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. She stopped beneath it and looked up. The chain made a faint creaking sound. The frog blinked. She blinked. Then they moved on again. There was a servant's door nearby, low and narrow, with a brass handle worn to a dull yellow. It was closed, but she could hear faint noises behind it. The shifting of pots, the low murmur of someone humming a tune without notes, just breath and movement. Breakfast, most likely, being prepared for someone else. She did not go through that door. She passed it by and turned toward the spiral stairwell at the end of the hall. The stairs were made of stone, wide enough for two people to walk side by side, though no one ever did. The banister was cold to the touch, made of iron wrapped in leather, long since worn to a dark smoothness. She ascended slowly, step by step, not because she was tired, but because the pace matched the mood of everything around her. Up one, then another, and another. The frog remained still. They reached the landing. The windows here were slightly larger, casting a wider light onto the stone floor. Dust floated in the sunbeam, little specks dancing in slow spirals, moving just enough to remind her that time was still passing, even if it didn't feel that way. There was a chair by the window. It had a thin cushion. She sat down, set the frog on her lap. They stayed there for some time. The window overlooked the garden, not the royal garden, but the one behind the kitchens, where herbs were grown in orderly rows. She could see sage, thyme, something leafy. She could never remember the name of gardener. Moved slowly among them, bending, plucking, standing, then bending again. No one spoke. The frog closed his eyes, not completely, just enough to look almost asleep. The princess looked out the window, then she looked down at her hands. Then she looked at nothing in particular, and the morning passed, not with haste, not with drama, but with the sort of quiet drifting that doesn't seem to lead anywhere, and doesn't need to. For a long while, the princess did not move, and the frog, who had already settled onto the folds of her gown, did not move either. There was no pressing matter, no signal that anything needed to begin or end. The light coming through the window had changed very slightly enough that it slanted now, casting a stripe across her knees, but not enough to make her feel as though she ought to get up. The warmth of the sunlight was faint. It wasn't the kind that invited a nap, nor the kind that made one blink and sigh. It simply existed, like something forgotten but still quietly present, like the scent of paper or the memory of a room that had always been there. Below, the gardener continued his slow and methodical movements. The princess could not see his face clearly from this angle. His back was turned to her most of the time, hunched forward slightly as he moved between the herbs. He worked with a rhythm that wasn't hurried and wasn't quite lazy, either more like a pattern that had been learned over many years, repeated so often it no longer needed thought. Sometimes he stood, sometimes he bent, sometimes he reached forward to pinch a bit of green with his fingers, then stood again, holding it loosely as if deciding whether it was what he needed or not. From the way he moved, It seemed he never really decided. A gentle wind pressed against the window pane, not strong, not sharp, not even really a breeze, but more like the breath of the day shifting a little to one side. It did not rattle the glass. It didn't even shake the vines that had long ago climbed up the outer stone wall and crept across the edges of the frame. The vines, brown and green in a colorless sort of way, did not seem to care much about the seasons or time. They just were. The princess finally exhaled, long and low, like someone remembering they were still breathing. Then, without any real urgency, she rose from the chair. The frog stayed where he was until she adjusted her skirt, and then he slid into her palm once more, nestling in the curve between her fingers like a coin one didn't quite intend to spend. She left the room. The hallway was just as quiet as before. The dust in the air had not settled, nor had it thickened. It simply remained suspended, twirling slowly under the indifference of time. She made her way down the spiral stairs again, slower this time, her steps even more careful, as though trying not to disturb the air around her. Back through the corridor, she went past the tapestry of the stag, past the sealed pitcher on its dust-ringed table, past the chain that still held the unlit lantern, which still swayed the tiniest bit, though still no breeze could be found. She reached the garden door. It was made of wood that had grayed with age. Once, long ago, it had been painted green perhaps, to match the herbs and plants that grew beyond it. But now the paint had mostly worn away. Only fragments remained in the cracks, clinging on like memories of a livelier time. The latch was cool to the touch and reluctant to lift. It scraped against the plate when she pressed it down, then gave way with a mild thump. The garden greeted her not with color or scent, but with a kind of drowsy stillness. There were no bees today, no butterflies, not even the low drone of insects in the grass. Everything felt paused, as though the entire garden had chosen this particular moment to stop growing, not forever. Not in protest, just temporarily, like taking a deep breath and not letting it out yet. She stepped onto the garden path, made of flat stones that had long ago sunk unevenly into the earth. Grass had begun to grow between them, and in some places the path was less a path and more a suggestion. Her shoes made a soft tapping sound that barely registered. She did not mind where she stepped. To her right, the rosemary stood in rows that were no longer straight. To her left, a patch of something leafy curled toward the soil, with edges yellowing slightly, as if unsure whether to continue living or not. The garden was not overgrown, but neither was it manicured. It existed in that peculiar state where everything seemed managed just enough to avoid chaos, yet not enough to feel cared for. She reached a low wooden bench nestled beneath an old tree. The tree was not especially tall, nor wide, nor grand. It was the kind of tree that one forgets the name of, the kind that doesn't blossom, doesn't bear fruit, and doesn't drop colorful leaves in autumn. Its branches twisted out with slow indecision, and its bark was the color of faded parchment. She sat down. The bench creaked under her weight, not alarmingly, but in a way that reminded her how long it had been there. The frog settled beside her on the flat of the bench. He did not croak, he did not shift. He simply sat, his body absorbing the warmth of the sun-dappled wood. They stayed that way for a time. The sun filtered through the leaves in patterns that were not particularly interesting. There were no dramatic shadows, no sharp contrasts, just small patches of shifting light, like thoughts that came and went without making any real point. She looked ahead, not at anything in particular. There was a bush of mint nearby, its leaves thick and slightly curled, not glistening with dew, not heavy with scent, just sitting there, doing what mint does. Farther down the garden, a patch of lavender stretched half-heartedly across a border. A few stalks leaned sideways, as though tired of holding themselves upright. The purple of the flowers had faded since spring. Now they were more grey than violet, more memory than presence. The wind stirred against, soft like a hand brushing a tabletop, without meaning to move anything. The princess closed her eyes for a moment, not because she was tired, not because she wanted to sleep, just because there wasn't much to look at. With her eyes closed, the garden did not vanish. It simply quieted further, as though agreeing to take a break from being seen. She could still feel the sun on her cheek, still hear the distant clatter of a door opening somewhere far across the courtyard, still smell the faint bitterness of sage and the earthiness of damp soil. The frog, too, remained still. If he had thoughts, he did not share them. If he had plans, they did not show. He looked forward with his wide, shallow eyes and did not seem to find the world troubling or surprising. It was simply there, and that was enough. A leaf fell from the tree above them. It drifted slowly, turning over and over, before landing on the bench beside her. She did not brush it away. Time passed. The kind of time that doesn't count minutes or measure moments. It just slides gently from one shape to another, unnoticed. Somewhere in the distance, the faint clanging of a kitchen bell could be heard. It was not sharp. It wasn't even clear whether it was meant to signal anything urgent. It sounded as though someone had tapped a pot with the back of a spoon and then forgotten to do it again. The princess opened her eyes. Nothing had changed. Nothing had needed to. She looked at the frog, who blinked once, and then looked away. Together, they continued to sit on the bench, under the not-special tree, in the not-busy garden, with the light continuing to arrive from above in shapes that didn't mean anything, and sounds drifting by that didn't insist on being heard. It was the middle of the day now, or perhaps not quite the middle, or just after, or before. It didn't really matter. After a time, not a measured time, not the kind marked by clocks or bells or anything with numbers. The princess shifted her weight on the old bench. The plank beneath her creaked once again, though not in protest. It was the same soft creak it had offered earlier, like a memory being repeated more than a sound being made. The frog remained still. He hadn't moved since she sat down beside the mint bush and the tree that didn't do anything special. But he wasn't asleep, or if he was, he didn't show it the way humans do. His eyes were open, but they didn't blink often, just now and then, in no particular rhythm. One might have assumed he was waiting, but it didn't seem like waiting, just being. The princess looked down at him. She didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, and not because there was anything wrong between them, but simply because words hadn't felt necessary in a while. The kind of silence they shared was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just a space between them that didn't demand to be filled. Beyond the garden, the sun had dropped a little lower in the sky. Not dramatically. It hadn't painted the world in golden tones or streaked the air with pinks and oranges. It just leaned, quietly, gradually, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping room as they sat down. The princess ran her hand along the edge of the bench. The wood was dry and flaked just slightly, like the outer layer of old bark. Her fingertips caught on a small splinter, but not enough to hurt, just enough to notice. She stood up, her legs tingled slightly, the way they do when you've sat too long in one position. She gave them a moment, rocked her weight back and forth between feet, and adjusted the folds of her dress that had gathered unevenly at her side. The frog looked up, then looked forward again. There was no ceremony to leaving. She simply began to walk, not toward any particular part of the garden, but in the general direction of the path that led back toward the castle's east wing. The path was not the shortest one. There was, in fact, a quicker way, a narrow route between two rows of flattened cabbage plants, just behind the faded sundial with no visible numbers. But she did not choose that way. Instead, she took the longer route, the one that curved slowly around the dormant fig tree, past the place where the stone wall had cracked decades ago and been left unfixed. The frog hopped gently off the bench and followed. His hops were small and even, not quick, not anxious, just enough to keep up. The gravel path gave way to a section of mossy stone. The moss had crept in slowly, year after year, without permission or resistance. It wasn't soft, exactly, but it was quieter underfoot. The princess walked in a slightly zigzagged line, not to avoid the moss, but just because there was nothing insisting she walk straight. Around a corner, a wooden trellis stood, half collapsed. Once, it had supported morning glories. Now, only 2 or 3 spindly vines lingered there, their leaves browned and curled at the edges. She touched the side of the frame with the tips of her fingers as she passed, not to fix it, not even to examine it, just to acknowledge it. The garden wall, low and crumbling in places, followed alongside her for several yards. A small bird, unremarkable in color and size, fluttered down from a nearby branch and landed near the frog. It hopped twice, looked around, found nothing of interest, and fluttered off again without any urgency. The frog did not react. The princess passed beneath an archway formed by 2 leaning trees. It was not a formal arch, not designed, just a shape made by the way 2 trunks had grown toward each other, perhaps seeking light, perhaps just because they could. Leaves rustled faintly above her, but not enough to call attention to themselves. Eventually, the stones underfoot gave way to packed dirt, then to an uneven series of slate tiles that marked the return to the castle's edge. She paused here, not because she had reached anything of note, but simply because the transition between garden and castle, nature and stone, felt worth noticing in a distant sort of way. The air here was slightly cooler. The wall beside her bore faint streaks of lichen in pale green patterns that looked vaguely like maps of places no one had ever visited. The frog stopped a foot or 2 behind her. The princess did not turn, but she waited a moment longer before stepping up onto the stone walkway that led to the east wing's back entrance. This door was seldom used. It was smaller than the main entrances, tucked behind a low hedge and shadowed by an overgrown climbing rosebush that hadn't bloomed in years. The doorknob stuck slightly. She gave it a soft pull and a slow twist, and the door gave way with a reluctant sigh. Inside, the corridor was quiet and dim. Not dark, exactly, but filled with the kind of light that comes through old, dust-specked windows. The kind that dulls edges and gives everything the soft hue of parchment. The stone beneath her feet was cool and dry, and her footsteps echoed in a lazy, uneven pattern that didn't match her pace. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, not because she wanted to draw the moment out, just because that's how people walk when there's no reason to hurry. On one side of the hall, a row of portraits hung in crooked frames. She had seen them before, dozens of times. Faces that no one remembered the names of. Pale, distant eyes. Collars of lace. Lips that almost smiled. She didn't stop to examine them, but she looked, just briefly, as one might look at scenery through a window on a slow-moving carriage. There, but not demanding anything. The frog hopped along the corridor behind her. The tapping of his small feet echoed softly in the long space, punctuating the stillness. They reached a staircase, wide and shallow, leading up to the rooms that overlooked the courtyard. The princess placed one hand on the railing. The wood had been worn smooth by generations of fingers, and the polish had long since faded. It no longer gleamed. It no longer even pretended to be decorative. It simply served its purpose, and she let her hand glide along it as she climbed. Each step made a quiet sound, not sharp, not heavy, just enough noise to mark movement. Up they went, one floor, then the next. She did not count the steps. She did not notice the change in air temperature or the way the stone walls grew lighter with each level. She simply climbed, and the frog followed. At last, they reached the hallway that led to her chambers. The air here was still. The curtains on the tall windows did not move. The rug beneath her shoes had a faded pattern of vines and birds, though most of the birds were worn into suggestion. The hallway table bore a silver vase with nothing in it. She passed it all without reaction. Her hand reached her door's handle without thought. She opened it. The room beyond was unchanged. The chair by the window still sat at an angle. The footstool was slightly off-center. The table with the forgotten book remained untouched, the book open to the same page, the one she hadn't read. Dust had begun to gather in the creases of the spine. She stepped inside. The frog followed. She closed the door behind them with the softest of clicks. No lock, no key, just the quiet returning of wood to wood. She walked to the window and stood there a moment. The sun now hovered low in the sky. Not sunset, not yet. Just the suggestion of day's end beginning to lean forward. The garden beyond glowed faintly, though not with color, more with the hush of waning time. Behind her, the frog settled once again near the edge of the rug. He looked around as if noting nothing in particular. The princess did not sit yet. She stood by the window, not thinking, not wondering, just letting the stillness settle around her. And as the room filled with the soft light of late afternoon, no one spoke, nothing changed, and nothing needed to. The room, though neither large nor small, held itself quietly. It had done so for years, perhaps decades, perhaps even longer, though no one had ever taken the time to count. There was a modest sort of dignity in the way the walls met the ceiling, not in grandeur or craftsmanship, but in the simple fact that they had remained there, together, without complaint or urgency. The princess stood at the tall window for some time. She wasn't looking out in any active way. Her gaze passed over the garden, over the quiet branches of the trees that moved just slightly with a breeze that couldn't be heard. The leaves shimmered faintly, not from brightness, but from their own still effort to remain suspended, not quite still, not quite moving. The sun, now lower still, filtered through the glass in long, softened streaks. It touched her shoulder, then moved away, as if undecided on whether to linger. Behind her, the frog remained near the edge of the rug. He was not close to the hearth, nor far from it. He sat precisely where he had landed when he last hopped, and that seemed to be enough. The pattern beneath him, a set of pale, repeated vines winding into rounded loops, made a sort of unintentional border around him, as though the rug had always expected him to arrive and sit there, exactly there, without fanfare. The princess turned slightly, not quickly. She did not shift her weight with any urgency. She simply rotated her shoulders, then her hips, and then turned her feet, one at a time, until her body faced the inside of the room. Her arms remained at her sides, not swinging or folding, just resting. There were several chairs in the room, one near the window, with a back slightly higher than the others, another closer to the hearth, whose cushion had sagged just enough to become familiar. A third, tucked beside a small round table, with legs that wobbled gently on the uneven floorboards, but never enough to tip. She chose the second, the one near the hearth. She lowered herself into it slowly, but not with any sense of ceremony. There was no sigh, no moment of dramatic repose. She simply sat, her hands resting on her lap, her ankles crossing without intention. The hearth was not lit. It had not been lit in several days, possibly longer. A few small pieces of wood still lay at its base, remnants of an old fire that no one had swept away. Ash rested in soft patches, like grey snow. The iron grate held a faint squeak when touched, though no one touched it now. The princess looked toward it, but only loosely, the way one looks at a memory rather than a flame. The room had no ticking clock, no pendulum swung, no hourglass spilled its sand in the corner. Time passed, not with movement, but with stillness. The sort of time that settles into objects rather than being measured by them. The walls, a soft grey that once may have been a different colour, held onto the light in thin, trembling layers. Shadows gathered gently in corners, but not urgently. They did not creep. They arrived, slowly, like guests who did not need to be announced. Outside the window, a bird, the same type as before, or perhaps a different one altogether, landed on a narrow branch. Its feathers were muted, its movements quiet. It did not sing. It did not ruffle its wings in excitement. It simply stood, observing the end of day the same way the room did, with quiet, uneventful presence. The castle's windows, most of them small and narrow and slightly arched at the top, let in only the softest bits of moonlight. It filtered in like dustwood, not strong enough to light the way, but just enough to show that darkness had settled and wasn't in any rush to leave. In the long corridor that stretched behind the dining room, the one lined with mismatched chairs and paintings no one remembered hanging, there was no sound. One of the chairs had a broken leg and leaned slightly against the wall for support. No one fixed it, no one sat on it, but it remained where it was, like an old story that no longer had a plot but still occupied space. The paintings were dull, not because they were poorly done, but because time had softened every brushstroke into the same muted hue. One showed a garden with roses. Another depicted a hunting scene where no one looked particularly interested. A third showed a ship caught mid-sail, though the sea beneath it looked more like a puddle than a wave. The frames were all different sizes and styles. One had a corner chipped off. Another hung just slightly crooked. They were not arranged with any logic. They simply were. The princess didn't pass this hallway tonight. She had before, on other nights that resembled this one, but tonight she stayed where she was, in the room with the rug, the fireless hearth, and the frog that sat without expectation. She hadn't spoken for quite some time, neither had the frog, not out of discomfort, not out of stubbornness, but because there was nothing to say that couldn't just be thought and forgotten again. The chair she sat in had molded slightly to her posture, not because it was well designed, but because she had sat there long enough for stillness to reshape it. The wooden armrests were smooth from years of gentle wear. Her fingers rested lightly on them, not with tension, but with the kind of contact that happens when someone doesn't have anywhere else to place their hands. In the corner of the room stood a table with 3 legs, though it had once had 4. The missing leg had not been replaced. Instead, a small stack of books supported that side. The books were not about anything in particular. One was a collection of poems that didn't rhyme. Another was a history of a region no one lived in anymore. The third was blank. Its pages had never been written in, and likely never would be. On the table sat a bowl of dried fruit, though it had been there so long that the fruit had turned leathery and hard. Not moldy, not fragrant, just ... dry. The bowl had a crack in its rim. It didn't leak, but it didn't hold water either. Not that anyone had tried. The wind tapped once at the window, just once. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't a breeze. It was just a momentary hello from the outside. A reminder that weather still existed, even if no one inside took notice of it anymore. Beyond the castle walls, the trees had become silhouettes. They didn't sway, not in the way trees do when trying to be poetic. They simply stood, the same way they had stood for decades, maybe centuries. Their branches reached upward, not in longing, but in the way branches are simply built to reach. A single owl blinked from a branch. It didn't hoot, it didn't fly. It blinked again, then did nothing else. Inside, the frog had shifted ever so slightly, just a nudge. Enough to move one toe a fraction of an inch. It wasn't a purposeful movement, more like a ripple that had finally reached him after hours of stillness. His eyes remained open, though they gave no sign of interest or awareness. They just existed. The fire, great, cold and grey, had gathered a fine dusting of ash long ago. It hadn't been touched. No one knelt to clean it. No one arranged logs. The poker leaned against the hearth at a slight angle, as though tired of standing straight. Its metal had tarnished just a little, giving it a dullness that matched the rest of the room. A small rug lay in front of the hearth. Not the larger one where the frog sat, but a thinner one, frayed at the edges and worn 2 threads in the middle. Once, its pattern may have shown flowers or stars. Now, it looked like clouds that had forgotten their shape. A chair sat nearby. It had not been moved for many days. Its cushion sagged gently in the center, and there was a faint indent from the last person who sat there. No one remembered who that had been. It might have been the princess herself. It might not have been. It didn't matter much. Time, in this room, had chosen not to pass in straight lines. It curved and folded and slowed. Not enough to reverse, not enough to stop, but enough to feel like breathing had become optional. The ceiling above had darkened, not from smoke, not from rot, just from age. Beams stretched across it in quiet lines, each with small cracks and soft dust nestled in corners no broom could reach. A spider's web, carefully built but long abandoned, clung in the corner, thin and delicate, like a memory barely held onto. The princess adjusted her position slightly, not out of discomfort, not out of need, just one of those shifts the body makes when it wants to remind the world it's still there. Her eyes blinked slowly, once, then again, but she wasn't tired in the way that required rest. She was tired in the way that comes from being awake too long without anything to do. The frog croaked, just once, a short sound, not alarming, not eager, just a statement of presence. She looked at him. He didn't look back. Or maybe he did, and it simply didn't show. The moonlight had stretched now, a thin beam landing across the floor, touching the edge of the rug and reaching just far enough to touch the frog's shadow. The light didn't move quickly. It drifted, as if not even trying to go anywhere. Far away, a bell rang. It was not loud. It was not close. It wasn't even clear what it signaled, but it rang once, and then didn't ring again. The room heard it, and forgot it. Somewhere, water dripped. Once, then not again for a long while. The night deepened in tone, not in temperature, not in mood, just in depth, like ink settling into the grain of wood. The princess blinked again, then sighed, then did nothing else. The frog remained seated, The rug accepted him, and the castle did not change. The castle had many hallways. That much was certain. It wasn't a grand castle, nor was it a cramped one. It simply existed with the sort of slow certainty that didn't make a show of itself. The hallways varied in length and width, but they all shared one thing, a certain sameness that made walking through them feel like time had folded in on itself. One hallway, in particular, was long, not dramatically so, just long enough that walking from one end to the other didn't feel like a task, but also didn't feel like an achievement. The floor was made of uneven stones. Some were slightly raised, others dipped just enough that if one weren't paying attention, their foot might pause awkwardly for a moment before continuing. But mostly, the stones kept to themselves. They stayed in place. They didn't creak or echo. They simply held the weight of whoever passed over them, then forgot about it. On either side of this hallway stood doors, not identical doors. Each had its own slight variation. Not in the wood here, a rusted hinge there, a handle that had been replaced with something not quite matching. None of the doors were locked, but most of them were closed. Some hadn't been opened in weeks, others not in years. Behind those doors were rooms, rooms with chairs, rooms with tapestries, rooms with dust motes spinning slowly in corners. One room had a harp in it. The harp had one broken string. No one remembered when it had snapped. The rest of the strings were still there, but none of them had been played in some time. Not because of neglect, simply because no one had the impulse to make sound anymore. Another room held a wardrobe. Inside were cloaks. Some were velvet, others wool. A few had embroidery stitched along the hems, though much of it had faded. None had been worn recently. They remained hanging, not out of reverence or rejection, but because there simply hadn't been a reason to move them. The hallway's walls were lined with sconces. They were built to hold candles, but most were empty. A few still had wax clinging to the base, curled slightly from the last time they were lit, which might have been months ago, or longer. It was hard to know. The walls were the color of stone that has long since accepted it no longer needs to impress anyone. A few cracks ran along the surface, but none threatened collapse. They were just their lines in the face of something that had lived a long, unremarkable life. Halfway down the hall was a window, a tall, thin one that didn't open. It had no curtain, no shutter, just the glass, slightly smudged with age. Through the window, one could see the garden, or at least a part of it. The garden had grown wild in recent years. Not unruly, just unmaintained. There were flowers, but not the kind that arranged themselves neatly. These were the sorts of blooms that came and went as they pleased. Some had tilted sideways, others had bowed forward. A bush leaned into a path that was no longer used. The fountain at the center still stood, though no water flowed. Moss had settled around the base like an old friend that never planned to leave. The window sill had a single object on it, a stone. It wasn't carved, it wasn't polished, just a stone grey, round, smooth on one side. Perhaps someone had placed it there a long time ago and forgotten. Or maybe it had been carried by a bird, or rolled in from an open window in years past. It didn't seem to mind its position. Back in the hallway, the air was still, not stale, not fresh, just the kind of air that doesn't bother you either way. It wrapped itself gently around whoever walked through, without pressure, without temperature. The princess had walked this hallway before, many times. Sometimes with purpose, sometimes with distraction. Tonight, she walked it simply because she had nowhere else to walk. Her steps were soft, not out of secrecy, just out of rhythm. Each footfall was quiet. Soft heel, quiet toe, slight shift in fabric. Repeat. She didn't count the doors. She never did. There wasn't a need. The hallway gave the impression that it could go on longer if it wanted to, but also that it might end at any moment. It was neither threatening nor welcoming, just there. She paused at one doorknot to open it, not to enter, just to stand near it. The wood was slightly warped from a long ago spill of water. There was a mark that looked like the shape of a sleeping cat, though no cat had been there. She touched the doorframe lightly with 2 fingers, not to feel anything in particular, just to give her hand something to do. She moved on. Further down, the hallway curved slightly to the right. The curve was so gentle that one didn't notice it unless they walked it regularly. The walls bowed outward just a little, as if sighing. The stones on the floor here were smoother perhaps from years of turning feet, or perhaps they had always been like that. Either explanation would do. There was another window at the bend. This one smaller, square. It faced nothing in particular, just a wall of ivy that clung to the outside of the castle. Sometimes a bird landed there, but not now. Now it was just ivy, unmoving and quiet. The princess looked at the ivy for a while. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her face held the same expression it had held most of the evening. The kind of calm that comes from expecting nothing and being offered exactly that. Somewhere behind her, in one of the distant rooms, a clock ticked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. Just the kind of tick that reminds the air that time exists, even if it has no direction. The sound did not echo. It was swallowed by stone and fabric and silence. She leaned slightly against the wall, not to rest, not to wait, just to stand with a little less effort. Her eyes didn't close, but they grew heavier in a way that suggested they might. Eventually, without any particular decision on her part, the hallway ahead continued. The hallway behind disappeared into the soft dimness of memory. No wind, no light, just hallway. Somewhere outside, the moon drifted a little higher. The stars stayed mostly still. A cloud shaped like nothing in particular moved from left to right, then faded into a darker one behind it. Inside the castle, the frog had not moved. He remained on the rug. He had blinked once, then not again for a while. His legs were tucked beneath him in that loose, lazy way frogs sometimes sit when they feel no reason to hop. The silence inside had deepened, not into heaviness, but into a sort of shared agreement between space and breath. Nothing needed to happen. Nothing wanted to. And the hallway continued, and the princess stood in it, and the doors kept their secrets, and the windows did not open, and the rug back in the fireless room still cradled the small weight of a frog, who had once been something else and might be something else again, but for now was exactly what he was, still, and the hallway did not end. By the time the princess had reached the end of that long hallway, if it could be called an end, she had stopped wondering where it led. It didn't feel like a destination. It felt more like a place where walking simply stopped, because there wasn't any more floor. Not abruptly, not jarringly. The stones just ran out, and the walls gave way to a narrow room, or maybe a wide alcove, where the only object was a wooden chair. The chair sat squarely in the middle. It wasn't centered by design, just by chance. There were no marks around it, no wear on the floor, no scuffing, no sign that anyone had dragged it, placed it, or cared about its presence. The chair was made of wood, not fine wood, not rough wood, just the kind of wood that made chairs and had for a long time. It had 4 legs. Each leg stood steadily, though one of them was a bit shorter than the others. It didn't make the chair wobble. It just meant that if someone sat in it, they might shift slightly to one side, but only slightly. It was the sort of imbalance that went unnoticed, if no one pointed it out. The back of the chair had 3 vertical slats, evenly spaced. The top rail curved very gently, not for style, just for the convenience of whoever had built it, likely long ago and without any fanfare. The seat was flat. There was no cushion, no indent, just wood, worn smooth in the places where weight had once rested, but hadn't in a very long time. The princess did not sit in the chair at first. She looked at it. She stood across from it. She considered nothing in particular. Then she moved closer. She placed her hand on the back rail knot to test its strength, but because her arm had drifted in that direction, and it seemed a reasonable thing to do, the wood was cool, not cold, just the sort of cool that comes from being inside a stone building where the sun only half remembers to reach. Eventually, she sat. Her dress rustled a little, the fabric folding into itself without protest. Her back did not straighten, it did not slouch, it simply settled somewhere in between, the way a person might sit when they don't have a reason to do it any differently. Her hands rested on her lap. Her feet, still inside soft-soled shoes, stayed close together. She did not cross her legs. She did not uncross them either. It would be difficult to say how long she remained in the chair. Time in that part of the castle didn't feel the need to assert itself. The shadows on the wall stayed where they were. The air remained unchanged. Not a single candle flickered, because no candles had been lit. Outside the narrow doorway, the hallway still existed, but it seemed quieter now, if that were possible. It wasn't that any sound had left it, was more that the potential for sound had withdrawn, like a guest slipping away from a dull conversation without announcing their exit. From the chair, the princess could see a small crack in the far corner of the wall. The crack wasn't large. It didn't seem threatening. It looked like it had been there for a very long time. It followed no pattern. It didn't branch or fork. It simply curved a little, then stopped. No one had patched it. No one had ignored it. It had just become part of the room. She watched the crack for a while. Her eyes didn't blink often, but they weren't wide open either. Just the kind of gaze that holds a quiet focus without any emotion attached to it. She wasn't waiting for anything to happen to the crack. She didn't expect it to move, or grow, or disappear. She was simply aware of it, the way one becomes aware of a thing only after enough time has passed without other distractions. After a while, her gaze shifted to the floor. There was a small pebble. It was grey, not round, not sharp. It had a shape that defied description, not unusual, not remarkable. Just the kind of shape that small rocks often take on when they've been left alone for years. She didn't touch it, she didn't move it. It remained where it was. So did she. Back in the room where the frog had been, the stillness had grown thicker, not heavier, just deeper. The frog had not moved again. His eyes, round and unblinking, gave no indication of alertness or sleep. He was somewhere in between, like a candle that had not been lit, nor snuffed out, just resting on the edge of potential. The fire had not been lit. The rug remained flat. The walls held their silence, like a held breath that no one planned to release. Elsewhere in the castle, a window creaked. Just once. It was not a dramatic sound. Just enough for a very distant ear to catch, though no one did. The window did not open. The wind did not blow. A leaf brushed against the outer pane and then fell away. In the room with the chair, the princess blinked. It was a slow blink. Not from fatigue. Not from boredom. Just the natural rhythm of eyes doing what eyes do. She shifted in the chair, not forward, not backward, just a slight motion to the side. Enough to redistribute her weight and then nothing more. The walls did not answer. The chair did not complain. The floor did not creak. She looked at her hands. They had not changed. Still folded. Still unmoving. Still hers. A distant bell rang. Once, then no more. It didn't chime a full hour. It didn't follow with a sequence. Just one tone, like the memory of a sound that thought better of becoming a pattern. The bell could have come from the courtyard, or perhaps a clock tower long neglected. It was impossible to know. She did not look up. She did not react. The sound faded before it fully arrived. And then there was only the chair again. Only the room. Only the narrow walls. The single crack. The single pebble. The single window many hallways away, where ivy had not moved in days. Her feet remained flat. The soles of her shoes, soft, worn, rested against the coolness of the stone. One toe shifted. The shift made no noise, and still she sat. The frog, if he could be called that anymore, was still curled on the rug, not sleeping, not waking, not waiting, not remembering. In another part of the castle, a candle wick tilted slightly in its holder. It had not been burned. It was not new. It simply existed in the way things sometimes do, without cause, without expectation. And the princess remained in the chair, her posture relaxed, but not slouched, her breathing gentle, but not sleepy. Her thoughts, if she had any, moved like clouds behind the mountains present, but not pressing. And the castle continued to hold its breath, not from suspense, not from dread, but from the kind of long, drawn-out stillness that comes when no one is asking anything of the world, and no one is offering anything in return. And the crack in the wall remained a crack, and the pebble remained a pebble, and the silence folded in on itself, and nothing changed. The morning light, such as it was, began to find its way into the long corridor again. It was not a dramatic sunrise, nor even a clear or warm one. It was the kind of morning that unfolded without making a point. Grey, not heavy with clouds, but lightly washed in them, like someone had stirred milk into water and left it in the sky. The light didn't stream in. It diffused, without edges, and fell into corners, without ever really brightening them. It was more suggestion than illumination. The boy who had once been a frog, though, no one was calling him either of those things, at the moment rose from where he had been lying on the rug. He did not spring to his feet. There was no decisive motion. He simply shifted one leg, then the other, then let his arms pull the rest of him upright. Not all at once. Just gradually, like a leaf finally slipping from where it had been resting, and finding its way to the floor with no urgency at all. He stood for a while, looking toward the window. The sky was still there. The trees outside remained the same. No wind moved them. The branches simply existed in their usual place, not swaying, not bending, not calling attention to themselves. His hand moved to scratch his shoulder, not because it itched, just because the moment seemed like one where a person might do something, even if it was small. He looked down at his feet, still bare, still quiet against the floor. He wiggled his toes, slowly. They moved without sound, and he paused to notice that, and then he began walking, not toward anything, just through the corridor. The hall ahead of him was neither wide nor narrow, just the kind of passage that existed because old buildings had spaces between rooms. The floor was made of smooth stones, some darker than others, none uniform. The irregularity gave the hallway a kind of silent character, but one that never introduced itself. The walls were bare, and they had been for years. Perhaps once they had held torches or tapestries, but not now. Now they just waited for footsteps, and even those arrived slowly. The boy walked with no rhythm, no pace. One step, then a pause, then another step and another pause. Not because he was tired, or cautious, or curious. He was simply walking in the absence of any better idea. He passed a door on his left. It was closed. He didn't stop. The door did not beckon, and so he didn't check it. Another few steps later, there was a recess in the stone, where once a statue might have stood. There was nothing there now. He looked at the empty alcove, and for a moment, imagined something that might have stood in a tay night, perhaps, or a cloaked figure, or maybe just a vase. But he didn't imagine hard. He didn't try to fill in details. He looked away before any clear picture formed. He kept walking. There was a window farther down the hall, with glass that had fogged slightly, not from temperature, but from age. It wasn't a window that opened. It wasn't a window that did much at all. But some light came through it, a dim, indifferent light, and the boy stopped for a moment to stand in it. He held out his hand, palm down, watching how the faint light touched his skin. There was no warmth. There was no glow. Just the pale suggestion of morning, giving a little attention before retreating again. Beyond the window, a garden could be seen. Not clearly, just barely. The outline of hedges, or maybe rows of something once tended but now overgrown. The boy didn't press his face to the glass. He didn't sigh. He didn't remember anything. He simply looked, then blinked, then walked on. The princess blinked slowly, not out of fatigue, necessarily, but because sometimes eyes need to remember themselves. She tilted her head slightly to one side, as though listening to something not quite present, but the room made no sound. Not the ticking of time, nor the whistling of breeze, nor the creaking of floors. Only the soft breath of quiet. Her gaze moved, gradually, to a shelf near the door. The shelf held 3 objects. A small ceramic pitcher with a faint chip on its rim. A folded cloth with embroidered edges, slightly faded from too much sunlight. And a narrow wooden box that had once held buttons, or coins, or perhaps bits of thread, though now it held nothing at all. She did not rise to touch them. She only noted them, quietly, the way one notes familiar things in a room they have always known. The pitcher, still useful but never used. The cloth, always clean, never unfolded. The box, always closed, never curious. The frog shifted his weight, not enough to be noticed, really, unless one was watching for it, which the princess was not. He moved just slightly to the left, one leg tucking beneath the other. It wasn't a gesture of comfort or discomfort, just adjustment, as if the air had changed by some tiny fraction and his body simply acknowledged it. The light continued to fade, not all at once, not even steadily, but in long, shallow waves. Each minute that passed didn't replace the one before it. It simply dulled it a little. The outlines of objects remained, but they softened. The colors of things, the rug, the chair, the faint flowers on the wallpaper, stayed where they were, but lost their insistence. They became quieter. The princess exhaled through her nose, a breath that did not announce itself, just one breath, followed by another, without thought or focus. Her fingers touched the edge of the armrest, not nervously, not with interest, but because they were there. The room didn't grow colder or warmer. The temperature, like everything else, seemed to agree with itself. It didn't shift. It just remained, wrapping itself around the inhabitants, the way water surrounds a slow-moving fish. A sound, if one could call it that, entered from the window. Not wind, and not entirely birdsong. Perhaps the sound of tree branches adjusting themselves slightly. Perhaps the sigh of ivy leaning into the wall. Nothing sharp, nothing new, just the sound of a day becoming night without permission or pause. The frog blinked. Once, then not again for a long time. The princess looked toward him, though not directly. Her eyes passed across the space between them, lingered briefly on his green form, then moved on, as though he were part of the rug, or the pattern on the floor, or the still air itself. She did not speak, not because she couldn't, not because she chose silence, but because, sometimes, silence chooses the moment. It arrives not with purpose, but with gravity, and to break it would feel like stepping into a dream before it had finished forming. She adjusted her position in the chair, not to settle in more deeply, not to move, just to acknowledge the shape of sitting. One foot uncrossed itself, only to cross again in the opposite direction. Her back rested against the wooden slats. The cushion beneath her adjusted to her weight, accepting it without comment. The light dimmed further. It did not vanish. It simply folded itself thinner and thinner across the surfaces of the room. Like gauze, like mist, like time losing interest in being noticed. Stillness became fuller, not heavier, just more complete. The kind of stillness that holds the weight of all the movements that didn't happen. The words not spoken, the gestures not made, the questions not asked. The princess closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to let them rest. And in that moment, the frog remained exactly where he had been, and the room remained exactly what it was. And nothing, not the light, not the air, not the walls or the floor or the corners or the shadows, nothing felt the need to change. Everything simply ... continued, exactly as it was, exactly as it had always intended to be. In the southern wing of the castle, where the halls curved in slow bends and the ceilings were just high enough to carry a whisper but never an echo, the evening settled like a blanket that had no edge. The stone walls, pale from years of untouched sunlight, held the last bits of day in quiet folds. Not golden, not dim, just something in between. The kind of in-between that doesn't need a name. There was a hallway that led nowhere in particular. It had once been used by servants long gone, or perhaps by guests who didn't stay long enough to remember. Along the walls, faded tapestries hung like old thoughts, images of hunting scenes and birds in flight and trees in full bloom, though the colors had long since drifted into the same quiet shade of brownish beige. The edges curled slightly, but not in protest, more like resignation. Time had moved across them not with violence, but with sighs. Footsteps would not echo here, not because the stones were soft, but because the air had made a pact with silence long ago. A narrow table stood against the wall. It was made of wood no one could name anymore, dark, solid, with legs carved in a spiral that served no purpose but to remind passers-by that once someone had cared about details. On the table sat a bowl. The bowl was empty, though once it may have held fruit, or keys, or pebbles from a river walk no one remembered taking. Beside the bowl lay a single feather, grey with a white tip, possibly from a dove, possibly from some other bird, possibly placed there by accident. The princess passed this hallway once each day, not because she had to, not because it led somewhere, but because something about its stillness made sense to her. She often paused there, not to think, not to remember, just to exist for a moment among things that asked nothing of her. Today, like most days, she stopped halfway down its length. Her fingers brushed the surface of the wooden table, not with curiosity, not with intention, It was just the sort of thing one's hand might do when it doesn't need to do anything else. She didn't pick up the feather. She didn't straighten the bowl. She just stood. A draft moved past her ankle, cool but not cold. It likely came from the small slit of a window near the far end, the kind that was meant more for arrows than light. Dust danced in it. Dust that had been there long before she arrived, and would be there long after she was gone. The kind of dust that had seen hundreds of quiet hours and had learned not to expect more. She turned slowly and walked back the way she had come. Her shoes made almost no sound. The hem of her dress, a soft grey-blue that had faded to something gentler than colour, brushed against the stones as if trying not to disturb them. The stones didn't seem to mind. They had been brushed by many hems before. Back in the main hall, the chandelier above swayed a little. Not from wind, there was no wind. Perhaps from the shifting of air, or the memory of footsteps, or the breath of the building itself. Its candles had not been lit in some time. The wicks were blackened but unburnt, like reminders of intention rather than flame. The chain that held the chandelier stretched up into a shadowed dome, and no one quite remembered how it had been attached, or when. On a bench near the staircase sat a cushion. It had once been embroidered, but the thread had unraveled in a way that made the design look like vines without roots. The cushion sagged in the middle and gave off a faint scent of lavender, so faint that it could have been imagined. No one sat on it anymore, but the bench remained, as though honouring a promise not to be moved. The princess descended the staircase. Each step was even measured, neither hurried nor slow. The railing, a polished curve of old wood, felt smooth beneath her hand. It had been touched by many before her, but none recently. It gave a soft warmth, the kind that comes not from heat, but from long familiarity. Down the hallway, beyond a wide arch framed by stone, was the kitchen, or rather, what had once been the kitchen. Now, it was a place of cool surfaces and dry air. The fireplace, wide enough to roast a deer in older days, sat unused. Its grate had rusted slightly along the edges. The iron darkened into a colour best described as stillness. The copper pots that hung from nails along the back wall had lost their shine. They no longer clanged together when someone walked by. They simply waited, as if still expecting to be filled. A single candle stood on the counter, unlit, half-melted, likely left there by someone who meant to return but had forgotten why they'd come in the first place. The princess didn't light it. She didn't open any cupboards. She didn't lift the lid of the old soup pot. She just placed her hand, briefly, on the stone counter, not pressing down, not leaning, just resting it there like one might place a memory in a drawer. She stood in that kitchen for several minutes, listening not to the room, but to the lack of sound. It was the kind of silence that carried its own language, a language that didn't use words, a language made of still air and unmoving things. Eventually, she turned. Her dress moved just enough to remind the air she had been there. She walked back through the arch, up the stairs, down the hallway with the tapestries, back to the room where the frog still sat on the rug with the faint looped design. He hadn't moved. He hadn't croaked. He hadn't blinked. Or perhaps he had done all of those things, but so quietly, so uneventfully, that none of it mattered. The rug had accepted him again, the way a quiet pond accepts a still stone. The princess looked at him, and he looked at nothing. Not at her, not at the fireless hearth, not at the shadowed ceiling. He looked at what frogs often look at, the middle distance. She stepped around him. She sat in the same chair as before. She didn't lean forward. She didn't lean back. She simply became the shape of sitting. The air was a little cooler now. not cold, not warm, just enough to notice. The shadows had climbed the walls, but not all the way. The corners of the ceiling were darker than before, though not completely dark, just dim enough to feel like a thought trailing off at the edge of language. The princess rested her hands on the arms of the chair, not gripping, not relaxing, just resting. She breathed in, then out, then did it again, the same way as before. Outside, the trees made their own slow movement. The branches did not sway, they did not wave. They just existed with the wind. A bird passed by the window. It didn't stop, it didn't sing, it simply flew. The frog blinked, just once, then returned to stillness. The candle in the kitchen remained unlit. The feather in the hallway did not move. The bowl stayed empty. And the day folded into night the way a page folds into the spine of a book, without sound, without urgency, and without needing to be read again. Evening had become night, but not in a way that anyone would have noticed all at once. It had crept in slowly, not like a shadow, not like a curtain being pulled, but more like the gentle disappearance of color from the edges of things. The sky had faded into a dark blue that didn't feel dramatic. There were stars, but only some. Others hadn't bothered to show themselves. Or maybe they had, and the clouds had just decided to drift lazily in front of them. No one looked up to check. The boy stepped closer. Through the gap, he could see part of a tree. Not the whole tree, just part of its trunk, and one low branch that reached toward the wall like a hand, unsure if it should knock. The leaves were few. Some had curled in, and others had gone yellow at the edges, though none had fallen. The sky beyond was overcast but not threatening. It was the kind of grey that said nothing was going to happen today, or maybe tomorrow either. Beneath the window there was a bench. This one was different from the one in the hallway. It was wider, deeper. Not quite a bed, but not quite a seat either. The wood was darker and softer at the edges, worn smooth by the weight of time and silence. A thin cushion rested on top faded blue with a floral pattern that had all but disappeared. If flowers had ever been there, they had since given way to blurs of fabric and dust. The cushion sank a little in the middle, as though someone had sat there not too long ago. Or perhaps it had always sagged like that. The boy sat down. The cushion gave slightly beneath him, not in protest, more like recognition, as if to say, yes, here we are again. He leaned back against the wall, which was colder than the bench, but not unfriendly. The air from the window moved against his cheek in a long, breathless exhale. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't open them wider either. He just sat, looking, not at anything in particular. There was a shelf to his left, built into the wall. It held 3 objects. One was a jar with a cork stopper. Inside, a single feather curled softly, white and slightly frayed at the tip. It didn't seem like the kind of feather a prince would carry, more like the sort one might find beneath a windowsill on a windless day. The second was a folded cloth, cream-colored, neatly arranged, as though someone had taken care to keep it clean, even though it had no clear use. It might have been a napkin, or a handkerchief, or something else entirely. The boy didn't reach for it. The third was a book, thin, unlabeled. Its cover was leather, but cracked and peeling. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, perhaps decades, perhaps more. He thought about picking it up, then didn't. There was no clock in the room, no candle, no lamp. The light that came through the misaligned window was enough, though it didn't try hard to be. It just fell into the room, coloring the dust in faint, pale gold. A sound came from the hall behind him, a creak, soft, not footsteps, not voices, just the kind of sound that happens in places built long ago. He didn't turn around. He didn't feel the need. The room had accepted his presence, and he had accepted its indifference. He leaned a little more to the right, resting his shoulder against the side of the window frame. A splinter pressed through his shirt, but only barely. It didn't break the skin. It didn't demand attention. A leaf outside fluttered, then went still. Somewhere, a bird called once, and then stopped. The window, what passed for it made, another soft pass through the open gap in the window. It moved a curl of his hair, then forgot about him entirely. He looked at the shelf again, the jar, the cloth, the book. They remained as they were. A small shadow moved along the edge of the wall, possibly a cloud shifting outside, or perhaps just the slow adjustment of the sun, though neither had much urgency to their changes. Time passed. He wasn't sure how much. Enough. The room hadn't changed. He hadn't either, but something in the silence felt, settled, like a sigh that didn't quite escape, but it still made its way out in a quiet sort of way. Eventually, the boy stood. The bench gave a small creak as his weight left it. He looked once more out the window. The tree branch remained still. The sky had not cleared, but it hadn't darkened either. He stepped back into the corridor, and once again there was only the sound of slow, soft steps on old stone, making their way forward in no hurry at all. There was one final corridor. It wasn't longer than the others. It wasn't narrower or more interesting. It didn't bend dramatically or echo with the whispers of anything forgotten. It was just there. A hallway that continued because someone, long ago, had laid stone after stone and didn't know where else to stop. So it went on a little farther, as some things tend to do. The boy walked slowly. He wasn't tired. He wasn't particularly curious either. He just moved forward because that's what he had been doing, and stopping would have required making a decision. And there was nothing about this day or the many that came before that asked anything to be decided. The walls were bare. No tapestries, no sconces, not even dust that danced in the air. Just smooth, undecorated stone. The kind that had been touched by weather once, and now spent the rest of its time forgetting. At the end of the hall, there was a door, wooden, uneven. The handle was a bit crooked. The hinges creaked when he touched it, but only slightly. They didn't complain, they just noticed. He stepped through it, and he was outside. It wasn't a garden. It wasn't a courtyard. It was just a patch of open ground, dirt, a little grass, a few stones arranged in no particular way. There were trees near Binot, gathered like a forest, but not standing apart either. Trees that had grown where they happened to land. Some leaned, some stood straight, some didn't seem to care. There was a path, but it didn't go far. It led to a bench. The same kind of bench that had appeared in so many places. Wooden, worn, not uncomfortable. The kind of bench someone might sit on for a while without really meaning to. The boy sat again. He looked forward. Nothing particular met his gaze. No kingdom, no transformation, no one clapping, no trumpets, no grand reveals. Just the same open space he'd always walked through. Just the same air. The same kind of moment stretched long and quiet. He thought, for a moment, about the pond. The one he had come from. The one that hadn't been magical, except in the way that stillness always is. He wondered if it looked different now. He wondered if the lily pads had shifted, if the water still reflected the clouds in the same tired way, or maybe it didn't matter. He leaned forward. He picked up a small stone from the ground beside the bench. It was smooth on one side and chipped on the other. He turned it in his palm for a while, then set it back down. Time passed, or maybe it didn't, hard to tell. The sky had that same not quite blue color that gave away no hour. The wind nudged a few leaves, but didn't carry them far. The boy stood again, then sat again, and then stayed sitting. Because sometimes that's how endings happen. Not with a door closing, not with someone riding off toward a horizon, just with a figure sitting on a bench in a place that doesn't need remembering. The frog, the prince, the boy, whatever he had been, didn't become anything new that day, and that was fine. The castle behind him faded slowly into the hush of the trees. The birds didn't sing, the wind didn't pick up. Nothing dramatic stirred. The boy watched, and after some time, his gaze softened. And then there was no more watching, no more waiting, no more anything. Just a quiet, uninterrupted stillness. And if anyone passed by that clearing much later, maybe days, maybe years, they might have seen the bench. Or maybe not. They might have seen a boy sitting there. Or maybe it was a rock, or a shadow, or a trick of the light. Or maybe there was nothing there at all. And maybe that's how this story ends. Or maybe it doesn't. But nothing else happens. Not now, not ever. At the next corner, he turned not because he chose left over right, but because the left side sloped downward slightly, and that seemed easier at the moment. The floor curved gently. The air shifted a little. There was a faint smell of stone and damp wood. Not unpleasant, not strong, just the sort of scent that lingers in places that haven't asked to be noticed in a long time. He passed a bench against the wall. It was wooden, simple. Its surface had been rubbed smooth by time, not by use. No one had sat on it in ages. Still, he sat. He lowered himself slowly, letting the bench take his weight one muscle at a time, until he was resting again, as he had been in the room before. The hallway around him did not change. No footsteps echoed. No voices traveled. No creaks, no clinks, no movement. Only the distant sound of silence continuing to be silent. He sat for a while, then leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He did not bury his face in his hands. He did not close his eyes. He just looked at the floor again. There was a line in the stone, not a crack, just a line, maybe a join, maybe a stain. It ran from one side of the hall to the other. He followed it with his gaze, slowly. Then again, it wasn't fascinating. It wasn't boring. It was just something to look at while nothing else was happening. And then, after what might have been minutes or hours or only several long breaths, he stood again. The bench creaked gently beneath him. Not a loud creak, just a reminder that wood moves when it has something to hold. He walked on. There was another door, this one open. Inside, a small room. He stepped in, looked around. A fireplace with no ashes. A table with no dust. A pitcher with no water. A window with no view. He sat again, because sitting seemed to be the activity of the day. This chair was softer. It had a cushion, faded and thin. He adjusted himself slightly until it gave a little under his weight. Then he looked around again, even though he already had. The same fireplace, the same table, the same pitcher, the same lack of sound. Outside, a bird might have chirped, but maybe not. It was the sort of sound that could have been memory instead. He stayed in the chair for a long time. So long that even the act of sitting lost its meaning. And still, he remained, not out of comfort, not out of intention. Just because movement no longer felt more important than stillness. And the castle, as always, said nothing. The corridors didn't breathe, the rooms didn't echo. Time folded itself neatly and without announcement. He stood again. He turned back into the hall, and he kept walking. At a certain point in the corridor, which didn't end so much as gently change direction, there appeared a small staircase. It was not a grand staircase, nor a secret one, nor even an especially memorable one. Just a small, narrow set of stone steps, half tucked into the wall as if it had been added after everything else, almost as an afterthought. The kind of stairway that might have been designed for servants once, or perhaps built only because someone felt there should be a stairwell somewhere in that particular stretch of hallway. The boy didn't decide to go up the stairs. There was no decision. His feet simply turned in that direction and began to rise, slowly, gently, like they had done it before and forgotten. Each step was just high enough to require a small lift of the knee, but not so high that one noticed the effort. The stones beneath his feet were smooth in the middle, worn just enough by the soft traffic of quiet shoes. There was a handrail on one side, wooden, polished long ago, now slightly dulled. He ran his hand along it as he climbed, though he didn't need the support. It was just something to touch while the stairs went on doing what stairs do. The staircase turned once, not sharply, just enough that the wall in front of him became the wall beside him. A soft curve, a small shift in direction that didn't announce itself. As he climbed, the sound of his footsteps echoed in that half-hollow way stone stairwells do. A faint shuffle, a soft brush, not a sound that would carry very far, but just enough to remind him he was still moving. There was a window near the top, not a large one. The kind of window placed not to look out of, but to let in the suggestion of light. It was high and slightly smudged, and framed by stone that curved around it like a half-forgotten arch. Through the glass, the light was grey, again neither bright nor dark, just light enough to see without seeing clearly. He paused near the window and looked out, not because there was anything to see, but because it gave him something to do between steps. The view was of another roof, slanted, covered in slate tiles. Most were intact. A few were chipped. One or two had shifted slightly, as if the roof had shrugged at some point and no one had noticed. There was a bird sitting near the ridge. It wasn't moving. It might have been sleeping, or maybe it was a statue, or maybe he had imagined it. Either way, the bird didn't change shape, and neither did the view. He continued climbing. There weren't many steps left, or perhaps there were more than he thought. Time passed the way it does in stairwells, slowly and all at once. Eventually, the stairs ended. They didn't open into a grand room. There was no landing, no doorway of note, just a small square of stone floor and another corridor, much like the one he had left behind. The boy stepped onto the floor and stood still for a moment. There was a faint creaking somewhere nearby. Not recent, not current, just the memory of creaking, like wood that had settled once and left the echo behind. The hallway stretched ahead, but now it felt more enclosed. The ceiling lower, though not oppressively so. The walls narrower, though not tight. Just enough change to notice if you had nothing else to think about. He walked forward slowly. There was a rug along this part of the floor, a long, narrow runner. It was mostly beige, with faint red threads running through in a pattern too faded to identify. The edges curled slightly, and there were small wrinkles where the rug had buckled over time, resisting its flatness. He stepped lightly, so as not to disturb it. Of course, nothing was disturbed. The rug remained exactly where it was. The hallway led to a corner, which turned again, not quite a right angle, more of a bend. He followed it. There were paintings here, spaced every few feet, all in nearly identical frames, wooden, dark, with gentle ridges that caught the light in dull ways. The paintings themselves were portraits, mostly of people he didn't know, perhaps kings or noblemen, or just anyone who had once sat still long enough to be painted. Their faces were stern or distant or tired. One man had very small eyes, another had a mustache that curled at the ends. One woman wore a green dress, though it might have been blue before the color faded. He stopped at that one for a while, not because of her face, but because of the background. There was a tree behind her, the same kind of tree he had seen earlier in the courtyard, or at least similar enough. That kind of tree that didn't do much except stand. He looked at the tree in the painting, and then at the woman again. She was holding something, perhaps a fan, or a folded cloth, or maybe her hands were just resting that way. It was hard to tell. He walked on. There was a bench underneath the last portrait, short, wooden, with no backrest. He sat on it for a while. It wasn't especially comfortable. Not hard, not soft, just a place to sit. He let his hands rest on his lap and looked at the opposite wall, which was blank except for a single crack running down from the ceiling. It wasn't a dramatic crack, just a line, a shift, a suggestion that the building had changed its mind at some point. He stared at it without trying to find a shape in it. It wasn't that kind of crack. Eventually, he stood again and kept walking. The corridor sloped slightly downward now. Not a full descent, just a slow, barely perceptible lean toward something lower. The air changed again, though only just. It felt stiller now, as if even the walls had grown tired. There were more sconces here, still without candles, just brackets holding nothing. One had a cobweb stretched across it, so fine he only saw it when he turned his head slightly. He didn't touch it. He didn't walk faster. He simply passed it. There was a door at the end. It was closed, of course. It had a small handle, unlike the others. This one was brass, slightly tarnished, shaped like a leaf, or maybe a feather. He stared at it for a while, unsure if he would open it. Not because he was afraid, but because the door looked like it hadn't been opened in a very long time. He reached for the handle. His fingers brushed it. It was warm, just slightly. Not from use, but as if the brass had remembered the sun from a morning long past. He turned the handle slowly. The latch clicked, softly, gently. Then he pushed the door inward. It didn't resist. It didn't creak. It simply opened, the way a door opens when it has no reason not to. The room behind the door wasn't especially large, nor was it small. It was what one might call moderately sized, though even that would be giving it more character than it had earned. It had, for wallstone, like the rest of the castleland, a ceiling that was slightly vaulted in the way that old buildings sometimes are, not because of design, but because of the way time shifts structure. There was one window in the room. It wasn't centered, it wasn't high, it wasn't low. It sat off to one side, as if whoever installed it hadn't been particularly committed to symmetry. The glass was fog not from moisture, but from age, the kind of fog that settles in over decades, softening the world outside to the point where only the light remains, but none of the detail. A single chair sat in the center of the room, not against the wall, not facing the window, just there, in the middle. It was a wooden chair, the kind with a tall back that wasn't exactly straight, and legs that didn't quite match in length. Not so much that it wobbled, but just enough that it never truly felt steady. The seat was worn smooth, from use, though not from recent use. The polish had dulled into a kind of matte finish that only happens when years go by without anyone noticing. The boy stood in the doorway for a while before stepping in. His feet made a soft sound against the stone, not an echo, just a dull acknowledgement that he had entered. The air in the room was still, not stale, exactly, just quiet. The kind of air that hadn't moved in a long time, but wasn't resentful about it. There was a rug underneath the chair, circular, faded, a soft green, though it may have once been blue. The edges curled slightly, and there was a frayed spot on one side that looked like someone had once dragged something heavy across it slowly, without urgency and without bothering to fix the result. On the wall opposite the window, there was a painting. Not large, not particularly colourful. It depicted a landscaper, perhaps a field or a moor, or maybe a hill that was not quite a hill. There were trees in the distance, blurred by either the artist's intent or their lack of skill. The sky was a dull yellow, the kind that doesn't quite suggest sunset and doesn't quite reject it either. A sky that could belong to almost any time of day, and therefore belonged to none. The boy looked at the painting for a while, then at the chair, then at the window, then back at the painting. He stepped forward. He sat in the chair. It made a soft sound, more of a sigh than a creak. The kind of sound that a chair makes when it's used to being ignored, and doesn't mind being noticed once in a while. He placed his hands on the arms of the chair, not because he needed support, just because he didn't have anywhere else to put them. His fingers didn't fidget, they rested. His back didn't lean all the way against the backrest, but he didn't sit upright either. He found that middle place between alertness and ease, the way one does when sitting without any particular purpose. Outside the window, a tree swayed gently, not from wind. There didn't appear to be any, but the tree moved all the same, in that slow, imperceptible rhythm trees sometimes adopt when no one is paying attention. Inside the room, the silence continued, not oppressively, not notably, just there. There was a table near the far wall, small, square, unremarkable. On it sat a cup, porcelain, white, though not bright. Its surface had fine cracks beneath the glaze, the kind that form after years of temperature shifts, or simply after being forgotten in the same position for too long. The cup was empty, though it wasn't clear if it had ever held anything. There was no saucer, no spoon, no sign of a second cup, just the one. The boy didn't get up to look at it. He just noticed it and let it remain. In one corner of the room, a pile of folded cloths sat atop a low stool. Maybe they were blankets, maybe they were towels. The light didn't clarify, he didn't check. He simply noted their existence the way one notices shadows aware, but not engaged. Somewhere outside, a bird called once. Not loudly, not repeatedly, just once, as if remembering it was supposed to sing, then deciding against it. He leaned back a little more in the chair. The legs shifted slightly beneath him, but held. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling. There was a small crack there too, not long, not wide, just a line that moved from one corner toward the center, then stopped. He followed it with his gaze until it disappeared into nothing. His breathing slowed, not because he was tired, but because there wasn't any reason to hurry. The room didn't expect anything. The chair didn't demand posture. The walls didn't hold secrets. Everything was exactly as it seemed, and it seemed still. Time didn't stop in the room, but it didn't move either. It hovered, balanced, uninterested in progress. A breeze might have entered once, long ago, or maybe it hadn't. He couldn't remember. He wasn't even sure if he had been here before, but it didn't matter. The familiarity didn't require recognition. It just was. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, not even to rest, but to listen more closely to the nothing around him. There was a sound, maybe, a faint hum, or a ringing in the ears that wasn't caused by sound at all. The kind of auditory stillness that only appears when everything else has faded. He opened his eyes again. The window hadn't moved. The painting hadn't changed. The cloth in the corner was still folded, unchanged by time or attention. He let out a breath, not a sigh, not a yawn, just a breath, and let it dissolve into the room. Somewhere far away, a bell rang. Not nearby, not within the castle, just faint enough to wonder whether it had rung at all. He didn't react. There was nothing to react to. He stayed in the chair a while longer, a very long while, until sitting became not an action, but a state. Until the chair became not a piece of furniture, but a location. He belonged there for a time, or maybe he didn't. But for now, it was where he was, and so he remained. Eventually, after what might have been a very long while or just a moderate one, the boy stood up from the chair. There was no reason for standing. He wasn't summoned. He wasn't restless. He simply shifted from being seated to being upright, the way a breeze might shift directions for no particular reason. The legs of the chair gave a soft squeak against the stone floor, more from politeness than protest. The boy turned his head slightly, glanced one last time at the painting that had no name and the window that showed no clear view, then took a step toward the door. The door had not closed. It had not been asked to. It stood open as it always had, not wide but just enough for someone to pass through without needing to adjust their shoulders. It didn't creak on its hinges. It didn't swing or shift. It simply waited, in that way doors often do when they have become used to being ignored. He stepped out. The hallway outside was not brightly lit, nor was it particularly dim. It occupied that middle range of illumination that old buildings often adopt, the kind of light that doesn't invite attention, and doesn't do anything to avoid it either. The stone floor continued beneath his feet, its grey surface interrupted only occasionally by scuff marks or small patches of moss that had crept in over the years. To the left, the hallway stretched. To the right, it also stretched. Not in a dramatic way, and certainly not in a grand way. It wasn't a royal corridor. It wasn't the sort of place one might walk with purpose. It was, more or less, a space between spaces. A place for passing through, not arriving. But the boy began to walk down it anyway. His footsteps didn't echo sharply. They made a muted sound, the kind that's more suggestion than actual noise. Somewhere far off, a drop of water fell from something, maybe a pipe, maybe the ceiling, maybe neither, and landed with a faint plink that was immediately forgotten. The boy passed a door. It was closed. There was no handle. He didn't stop to investigate. A little further on, he passed another. This one had a handle, but it was tarnished, and a spider's web stretched from it to the wall beside it. The web trembled slightly as the air moved around it, though there was no breeze to speak of. He didn't touch the handle. The door, like the others, remained part of the corridor's slow monotony. After a while, the floor began to slope ever so slightly downward. Not enough to notice immediately, just enough that, over time, one might feel the pressure shift slightly in the knees or ankles. The hallway did not become darker as it descended. The light remained the same, a flat, timeless grey that gave no indication of day or night. A lantern hung from the ceiling on a long iron hook. It wasn't lit. It probably hadn't been in years. But the hook still held it faithfully, despite the dust gathered along the rim. A cobweb curled down one side like an ornament, and the glass was streaked with a film too faint to be named. The boy looked at it briefly, then kept walking. To his left, a narrow window appeared. It was tall and thin, not made for viewing, but perhaps for letting in light, though at this moment it let in only a dull haze. Outside, a tree limb touched the stone, brushing against it every so often in slow, deliberate movements. Or perhaps the tree wasn't moving at all, and it was only the trick of the light. Either way, the boy didn't stop. The corridor curved it not sharply, not suddenly. It eased to the right, as if reluctant to be straight for too long. The boy followed the curve, not because he was curious where it led, but because the alternative was standing still, and even stillness becomes a kind of movement when repeated too often. He passed a mirror. It was cracked across the center. The crack ran from the top left corner to the bottom right, like a single, decisive thought that had never been followed up. The glass was cloudy, and his reflection was soft-edged, almost unrecognizable. He looked at it for a moment, not to examine, not to reflect, but just to see, and then moved on. A small table stood beside the mirror. It held a bowl. The bowl was empty. Dust had settled inside the curve, forming a faint ring that suggested it had once held water, or perhaps pebbles, or perhaps nothing at all. Further down, a tapestry hung on the wall. Its threads had faded to the point of obscurity. A shape that might have once been a lion was now just a blur of tan and brown. The background, which might have once shown a battle or a feast, now resembled more of a cloud bank than anything else. The boy didn't touch it. He walked on. The corridor widened briefly, as if it had taken a breath, then narrowed again, returning to its usual restraint. There were no windows now, just walls, on both sides, lined with more of the same stone. The mortar between them had begun to crumble in a few places, leaving small pockets of air that whistled softly as he passed. The sound was so faint, it might have only been imagined. Eventually, he came to a wooden bench built into the wall. It was simple, uncushioned, the kind of bench meant for waiting, though there was no indication of what one might be waiting for. He sat down. The wood creaked slightly. The hallway didn't change. He looked at the opposite wall. There was a sconce empty, its candle long since burned away. A little moth sat on the edge of it, unmoving, perhaps sleeping, perhaps waiting for light that would never come again. The boy leaned back slightly against the wall, letting his head rest. The stone was cool, but not cold. The bench supported him, though it did not encourage comfort. He didn't mind. There was no discomfort either. He closed his eyes, listened. The sound of the corridor remained as it had been, quiet, but not silent, not lifeless, just slow, measured, like a room that remembers what it once was, but no longer insists on being anything at all. His breathing settled again, not into sleep, just into stillness. A long pause passed, measured not by clocks, but by the absence of need. He opened his eyes again, stood, continued walking. The corridor resumed its gentle slope, and he followed it, not with interest, not with dread, but with the quiet resolve of someone who has learned to walk without purpose, and to find in that purposelessness a kind of peace. The corridor had turned 3 times now, once to the right, then to the left, and then to the right again. The boy had followed it without noticing the pattern, because there was no real pattern. The turns happened as they happened, shaped not by decision but by time and stone and the slow settling of foundations laid long ago. The air had not changed, but the walls had subtly, quietly. Once smooth, the stone had taken on a rougher texture, like it had grown tired of being too refined. Some of the grout had flaked away. Small specks of it dotted the floor like dull snow that never melted. The boy's steps slowed, not because of fatigue, not because he'd reached anything worth stopping for, but simply because the corridor had started to feel like a place where quick movement might disturb something that had long been asleep. He wasn't sure what that something was, or whether it existed at all, but the thought lingered in the edges of his mind like fog over a field. Eventually, the corridor ended. It did not do so dramatically. It did not terminate in a heavy iron door or an archway. It simply widened into a room that seemed to have grown out of the corridor itself. No grand entrance, no decoration, just a soft expansion of space, as though the walls had stepped aside slightly, allowing for a pause in the otherwise continuous journey forward. The boy stepped inside. The room wasn't large, but it wasn't small either. It had the dimensions of a thought that didn't quite resolve. Enough room to move in, but not enough to get lost. The floor was the same stone as the corridor, though here it was slightly uneven. Perhaps the foundation had shifted, or perhaps it had always been that way. The walls bore the faint signs of old paint, the kind that once might have been soft green or muted cream, but had long since faded into nothing identifiable. Time had gently lifted the color away, as if brushing dust off an old story. There was a window, not a large one, not decorative, just a square opening in the far wall, framed by wood that had begun to curl at the edges. The window did not close properly. One of its hinges had rusted in place, keeping the left side stuck half open, while the right hung slightly lower than it should have. The result was a constant, almost inaudible whisper of air that passed through, even when there was no wind outside.